Joining me to discuss this disturbing resurrection of anti-Semitism is Shai, a former executive of the World Jewish Congress and a Middle East analyst. Shai, thank you for being with us. What do you make of this report?
It's not really news. I mean, it is news, but it's not new. There has been anti-Semitism in Europe for not only generations, but for millennia. What's interesting is that the percentage is large enough that it's clearly not a Muslim phenomenon. There's clearly deep-seated anti-Semitism across Europe, as there is in the United States.
When you say a Muslim phenomenon, you mean it's not just Muslims in Europe that are anti-Semitic?
Exactly.
That
there's a tendency by many Americans and some Israelis to blame Muslims, and people in Europe also will sometimes blame Muslims. And it's convenient for some of the governments to blame Muslims because then it's not their fault. They can say, oh, it's these immigrants. And now that there are right-wing parties that are taking over governments across Europe, they're very happy to use that excuse.
Is it a case of anti-Semitism not being seen as egregious as other forms of discrimination? You look at this poll and it says 1 in 5 believe that anti-Semitism is a response to the everyday actions of Jews. If I substituted Jews with the blacks, can you imagine the outrage? Why is there not the same level of outrage?
It's interesting because actually there is a lot of xenophobia in Europe beyond just Jews. In fact, in countries like Russia, Jews are sometimes beaten up because they're confused with Chechens.
So you're saying Europeans are just racists in general, both against Jews and black people and Muslims, that it's just a racist culture and Jews shouldn't be offended particularly?
Anti-Semitism in Europe is a uniquely insidious phenomenon. So I'm not saying just, but the increase in xenophobia across Europe for different factors has contributed to this anti-Semitism, I think. Not to the anti-Semitism itself, but to the expression of anti-Semitism.
Well, some of that xenophobia comes from refugees from the Middle East, from Syria, which are Islamic, completely the opposite of Jews. And you're saying that this is just gets conflated, just all gets lumped in with one category.
Well, there's maybe been 1 million refugees from the Middle East in the last several years into Europe. That doesn't even make up 1% of European public opinion. So that's not affecting these numbers of anti-Semitism.
It was very disturbing to see that very few Europeans actually know what the Holocaust is. How is that possible?
Well, I think 2/3 know. So, you know, if you ask the average European millennial what the Berlin Wall was, they may not be able to tell you. And that was just...
Is this a millennial history ignorance issue? Is that what you're saying?
It's partly. If you ask the average millennial in the United States what the Cold War was, they can't tell you.
We don't have the polls on that one, so I'm not...
Time does make a difference. 75 years since the end of the Holocaust. We find 100 years since the end of World War I was just marked. And nationalism is on the rise in Europe, partly because nobody is alive today who remembers what nationalism caused how it caused World War I. So 75 years is at least 3 generations.
Is it a problem that Holocaust denial is very ripe and prevalent and doesn't seem to get equal condemnation as other human rights that are spoken about, or violations rather? You have, for example, on social media, it's quite acceptable to post Holocaust denial comments and articles, and there's no censorship against that, or the censorship lets that through for some reason. You look at the president of Iran constantly tweeting that the Holocaust didn't happen and that Jews use that as an excuse for the state of Israel, and yet those tweets uncensored.
In most or all European countries, Holocaust denial is an actual crime. And I think Holocaust education has been increasing. There are tremendous efforts by the governments. I think we know that there are many anti-Semites all around the world. What we have to focus on is what are governments doing to address this? What is society doing to address this? And it'll take generations.
So what are they doing, and what should they be doing?
Well, there's actually coordination across Europe among different governments, within governments. There's a ministerial committee which I think still meets in France. Ministers who are relevant ministers in the French government meet on a regular basis, specifically to focus on how they're combating anti-Semitism through education, through law enforcement, through training. It's very important through media, various not only regulations but also guidelines.
Is it problematic that the head of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn, who may become the next Prime Minister of the UK, is an established anti-Semite, time and time again, by associations, by comments, and yet he is still the head of the opposition in the United Kingdom?
It's very problematic. And what's interesting is that there is a very vigorous debate now in the United Kingdom, specifically on this issue. But when there's a vigorous debate, you get very strong opinions on both sides. So people are now coming out of the woodwork because of him. Also, on the right, we have the UKIP party, which has been pushing Brexit and is very nationalistic. And there's anti-Semitism coming out from that side too. But as you say, Corbyn could be the next prime minister. So it's tremendous. It's a tremendous concern. Prime Minister Theresa May just, I think, earlier today had a meeting with community leaders specifically on combating anti-Semitism.
Shai, thank you. Appreciate your analysis. Thanks for being with us, Shai Franklin.